The laughter came before anything else. Not loud, not particularly mean, just a short, dismissive sound that somehow carried more weight than a direct insult would have. This was a place where reputations were built on swollen knuckles and cracked ribs, where the currency was knockouts, and the only philosophy that mattered was the one that kept you standing when the other man went down. Joe Frazier had heard a great deal of talk in his life, promoters promising easy money, challengers predicting his downfall, journalists explaining in careful, professional language why he was too short, too rough around the edges, too limited in his approach to ever be considered truly great. He had laughed at most of it and moved on, but this laughter was different in its target. This time, the man being assessed was Bruce Lee. Madison Square Garden, New York City, early 1972. Not a fight night, not the roar of 20,000 people packed into tiered seats. This was a closed training exhibition, organized for sponsors, athletes, and a carefully selected group of invited guests. Boxing people, journalists, and trainers moved through the floor seats while fighters warmed up in the ring. Joe Frazier was at the absolute peak of his powers, the heavyweight champion of the world, undefeated, an Olympic gold medalist, the man who had broken Muhammad Ali's jaw and put him on the canvas. 40 years of boxing tradition stood behind every step he took and every punch he threw. When Joe Frazier hit someone, they stayed hit. Bruce Lee had no business being there by the conventional logic of that room. He had not come as a challenger. He was not on any card. He was not wearing gloves or hand wraps or a robe with his name across the shoulders. He was there because someone from HBO had extended an invitation for him to observe, to consult on a future project involving combat sports and movement. To most of the people present, he was at best a curiosity, the kung fu film actor, the fast hands and the flashy kicks. Interesting to watch under the right circumstances, perhaps useful to cinema, but with no meaningful connection to what real fighting looked like. Boxing was real fighting. Everyone in that room either knew that or believed they did. Frazier was finishing a light sparring session, sweat running down his shoulders, breathing steady, eyes sharp and present, even at half effort. The way he moved through angles, the way his left hook seemed to hang in the air like a spring under permanent tension, made experienced fighters step backward without consciously deciding to. When he came through the ropes, trainers converged with towels. Someone passed him water. Cameras clicked from the floor. He smiled, relaxed, completely in his element. That was the moment someone made the mistake of making an introduction. "Joe," a promoter said casually, gesturing toward the slim figure in black standing near the ring's edge. "This is Bruce Lee. He works in film, martial arts. Fastest hands you will ever see in your life." Frazier turned with the towel draped across his shoulders and looked Bruce over from top to bottom. 5'7", perhaps 140 pounds after a full meal. No visible muscle mass by any boxing standard. No scar tissue, no thickened ears, no outward evidence of a life spent absorbing punishment. Just quiet eyes and a stillness that felt almost academic. Joe pushed air slowly through his nose and let out that short laugh. "This guy," he said, "man, one punch and it is over." The words did not need volume. They landed with enough weight to move through the small cluster of people standing nearby like a current. A few laughed along. A few nodded in the way people nod when something confirms what they already believed. This was not arrogance speaking. It was arithmetic. Mass multiplied by force. A man who had stopped elite heavyweights in their tracks was not going to be impressed by speed that came without the power to back it up. Bruce Lee did not react. He did not smile or stiffen or reach for a comeback. He listened the way he always listened when someone was telling him precisely how they understood the nature of fighting. Then he spoke. "I agree," he said, quietly. "If you land a clean shot, it is finished." That answer landed differently than Frazier had expected. He had been prepared for a protest, for deflection, for some philosophical detour or a joke. not for agreement. Bruce continued, his voice steady and without any edge in it. But the question is not what happens if you hit me. The question is what happens if you do not. A few heads turned in the surrounding group. The ambient noise of the room dropped by a degree. Frazier looked at him again, this time with more attention and less certainty about what he was looking at. He saw no fear in the man standing across from him, no aggression either, just a settled, quiet confidence that had no need to announce itself. "You saying I cannot hit you?" Frazier asked, still carrying the trace of amusement. "I am saying that hitting me is not as straightforward as it might appear." Another ripple of laughter moved through the group, louder this time. Someone nearby muttered that this was not a movie set. Frazier shook his head with a smile on his face. "Man, I've been in the ring with the best alive. Ali danced better than anyone you ever saw. Foreman hit harder than anything that has a name. Every one of them bleeds the same way. Speed does not change that equation." Bruce nodded. "You are right. Speed alone does not. Timing does." Frazier passed his towel to a trainer and moved to the ropes, resting his forearms across the top strand and leaning forward slightly. He was not angry. He was curious now, the particular curiosity of someone who is not threatened by something unfamiliar, but has not yet decided whether it deserves serious attention. "You want to show me something?" he asked, "because from where I'm standing right now, you look like a man who would break his hand on my shoulder." Bruce took one step forward and stopped at a respectful distance from the ring. "I have no interest in fighting you. You are a champion, and I mean that without any qualification. But if you are genuinely curious, there is one specific thing we could test." Frazier raised an eyebrow. "What, how easy it is to land that one punch?" The words settled over the group and stayed there. Several people shifted their weight without realizing it. This had not been scheduled. Nobody had planned for this. A heavyweight champion of the world and a martial artist in street clothes were moving towards something that had no official structure around it, and no one in the room with the authority or the inclination to stop it. Somewhere nearby, a trainer cleared his throat and said no. The charged atmosphere had settled into something more quieter and more thoughtful. Joe leaned back and looked at the man sitting beside him. "You ever think about boxing?" he asked. Bruce smiled. "I study it. I just don't belong in it." Joe nodded slowly. "Yeah, I don't belong in kung fu films either." They shared a brief laugh, easy and unforced. Then Joe's expression moved somewhere more serious. "What you showed me just now, that business with the space, the timing, that's real. That's genuinely real." Bruce looked at him steadily. "Boxing taught the world about distance. Martial arts taught the world about options. When you bring those two things together, everything starts to change." Joe stared out at the arena floor, which was emptying now, the crowd long gone. Madison Square Garden, without its audience, felt like something else entirely, like a cathedral sitting silent after the last service of the day. "People think fights end with punches," Joe said, working through the thought slowly. "But most of the time, they end the moment someone figures out they can't land one." Bruce nodded once. "Exactly." Joe stood up and stretched, his full height making the size difference between them plain again, though somehow the looming quality that came with that size had gone out of it. "You know what people are going to say about today?" he asked. Bruce gave a small shrug. "They'll say it didn't happen." Joe smiled. "Yeah, probably." He paused for a moment before adding a more serious tone. "But I'll remember it." The story didn't end inside that quiet arena, even though most of the people who had been present never spoke about it in any public way. There was no press release prepared, no footage aired on late-night television, no official acknowledgement that the heavyweight champion of the world had spent a portion of that afternoon failing repeatedly to touch a man who weighed nearly 100 pounds less than him. But moments that carry real weight don't simply disappear. They move through the world differently. They change shape as they travel, carried forward in conversations and in the private memories of people who felt something genuinely shift inside themselves while they were watching. In the weeks that followed, Joe Frazier returned to his established routine. Road work before the sun came up, heavy bag sessions that sent vibrations through the gym walls, sparring rounds where his left hook still arrived like a door being slammed shut with everything behind it. Nothing about his training appeared different from the outside looking in, but something underneath had changed, and the people closest to him picked it up before anyone else put a name to it. Joe began to pause more often in his work. He watched, he waited. The relentlessness and the aggression were still there, still intact, but now there was an extra measure of patience woven into his pressure, a sharper instinct for when the moment had arrived and when it was still coming. The difference between committing and letting the fight come to him had grown more deliberate. In the casual conversations that followed with fighters and coaches who raised the subject, Joe never laughed when Bruce Lee's name came up again. He didn't amplify the story or dress it up with details. He simply said, "That man understood timing in a way that most people will never get close to," and then he moved on to something else. Bruce, for his own part, never told the story either. From where he stood, it had not been a victory. It had been a demonstration, and demonstrations only served any purpose if they pointed towards something beyond themselves. He went back to his work with a sharpened sense of direction, continuing to develop the ideas that would eventually sit at the center of his philosophy: interception, economy of motion, the particular danger that lived inside overcommitment. He spoke often those years about how raw strength had a way of narrowing a person's understanding, how power could quietly become a limitation that prevented someone from ever seeing what lay beyond it. "One punch ends this," Joe had said. Bruce had turned that sentence and turned it inside out, because what he had demonstrated was not a method for surviving a punch. It was a way of making the punch cease to be relevant in the first place. Years after Bruce Lee's death, the story began surfacing again in pieces. A trainer mentioned it in passing during a conversation, a fighter let something slip in an interview, a promoter recalled watching Joe Frazier remove his glove and go very still and very quiet. Every version that emerged was slightly different from the last, worn and reshaped by time and the particular distortions that memory introduces. But the center of it held across every telling. A heavyweight champion had laughed, a martial artist had listened without reacting, and somewhere in the space between those two men, something true about the nature of fighting had made itself visible. Joe Frazier went on to fight more wars inside the rapes and added to a legacy that already placed him among the most genuinely difficult men who had ever competed at the highest level. His power never diminished, his courage never once wavered, but the people who knew him well understood that after that afternoon, something had been added to how he approached a fight, a deeper layer of intelligence, a quiet respect for the parts of combat that don't show up in statistics or highlight reels. He had seen briefly into a dimension where speed was not simply about moving fast, and strength was not simply about hitting hard. Bruce Lee's legend continued to grow along its own separate lines. People talked about his physical speed, his kicks, his presence on screen. They argued endlessly about whether he could have beaten boxers, wrestlers, champions from other disciplines. Those arguments consistently missed what he was actually doing. Bruce was never trying to establish that he could defeat everyone. He was trying to demonstrate that the rules everyone had agreed to believe in weren't the whole picture. The punch that would have ended everything was never thrown, and that was precisely the point, because the most dangerous instant in any fight is not the moment of impact, it's the moment just before it, when one person has already decided how it ends. That certainty, that settled assumption about the outcome is what Bruce Lee dismantled that afternoon. He did it calmly, without force, without theater, in front of a man who had every reason in the world to laugh at the idea that it was even possible. Joe Frazier